Sometimes I wonder if life could have turned out differently if my father hadn't left us so early. That spring day when he passed away, I was still a child, just 6 years old. But the memory of that moment is so vivid it feels like it happened only yesterday. I remember how, that very morning, he was making his famous pancakes. They weren't just pancakes, they were masterpieces. Every time, he managed to shape them into faces, not just round circles. He would laugh while showing me his latest culinary masterpiece, and I couldn't help but smile. Meanwhile, Mom was setting the table, humming a melody that I can no longer recall. The whole world, filled with the aroma of fresh pancakes, felt so cozy and familiar, as if it could last forever. Dad always called me to help. Vanna, princess, come help your old man flip these wonders, and I'd run to the kitchen, leaving my favorite plush bunny on the couch. No matter how old I get, I'll always remember how those moments felt so important, so joyful. But everything changed in an instant. When I ran up to him, he suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorted with pain. The spatula fell to the floor with a sharp clatter, and all I could see was his gaze, filled with fear and pain. Then came blurred lights, flashing sirens, and screams. Everything suddenly became foreign and terrifying. The ambulance, the long hospital corridors, and then, my mother's unforgettable cries. My father was gone, leaving us in this enormous house that instantly felt so empty and cold. After that, my mother struggled to pull herself together. She cried, but eventually, she met David. He was so different, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that stirred something like regret in me, though I couldn't understand exactly why. He was sweet enough to become a part of our lives. They got married a year later, and David moved in with us. I tried to get used to his presence, to his new role in our lives. But it wasn't easy. Then Mom surprised me again. She was pregnant. At that moment, I could barely hide my emotions, surprise, worry, and confusion. I was only 8, and now there was going to be another child, a new person in our home. Ignacio, whom I was supposed to love and care for, was born when I was 8. With his arrival, I felt like a completely different reality began in our lives. Mom left her job to become a homemaker. She said Ignacio needed her. I remember how she glowed when she said I would now be a big sister. But for me, it felt like a loss, like I was no longer needed as I had been before. I wanted to ask her, what about my early years? Weren't they just as important? But the words stuck in my throat like stones. Instead, I watched as she slowly lost herself in caring for Ignacio. Mom's eyes no longer sparkled as they once did, and she began to forget about me more and more. I started feeling this void, this invisible chasm between us. She forgot to pack my school lunches, and when I reminded her, she'd absent-mindedly say, "Oh, sorry, sweetheart, I got so caught up with Ignacio." David noticed how much this bothered me. He often wondered aloud if Mom was making a mistake in focusing so much on Ignacio. He worried, but his words couldn't change the situation. As Ignacio grew older, the tension in the house increased. I began to feel all the love and attention that had once been directed toward me slip away. David tried talking to Mom, explaining that she shouldn't forget about me, that she had 2 children, not just one. But every time, the conversation ended with the same response from Mom, "He's still so little. You don't understand." I was young, too. Like all teenagers, I believed the world should revolve around me, that my problems were the most important. But at the moment when I muttered something under my breath, it was already too late. No one heard me. And perhaps I'll never be able to explain how deeply I was hurt by those unheard words. There was so much in our home, but it lacked the one thing I needed most: attention, involvement, and care. The situation reached its peak when David suggested enrolling Ignacio in Little League Baseball. I was sitting on the stairs, staring at my homework, unsure of what I was even doing. I could hear their argument in the kitchen, words flying like sharp stones, cutting through the air. No, Mom's voice was piercing, full of anxiety. Do you know how dangerous baseball is? He could get hit by a ball or twist his ankle. For God's sake, Sarah, you need to understand that he's still a child, and you can't protect him from everything. He needs to experience life, David replied, his voice soft but firm. You can't lock him away. Mom refused to budge. Instead of agreeing with David, she signed Ignacio up for art classes at the community center, hoping it would be safer. I still remember how Ignacio sat there, staring at a blank sheet of paper with such despair that I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He dragged his brush across the paper, his movements aimless and uninterested. While other kids enthusiastically created art, he just sat there as if he weren't even present. After 3 classes, he quit, and Mom, as always, blamed the teacher, saying they didn't understand Ignacio's creative spirit. Meanwhile, David began spending more time with me. Perhaps it was his way of balancing everything that was happening around us, or maybe he just saw the spark in my eyes that I so desperately needed someone to recognize. He took me to karate lessons 3 times a week, sat nearby, and cheered me on, even though I screamed louder than all the other parents when I earned my next belt. My achievements became his pride, and for the first time in a long while, I felt wanted, important to someone. He gave me what I couldn't get from my mother, attention and recognition. But while I was flourishing, receiving what I had long been missing, Ignacio was becoming increasingly difficult. His room was a complete disaster. Toys, clothes, and books were scattered everywhere. And Mom would just turn to me with a look that seemed to blame me for his mess, as if I were responsible for his chaos and needed to clean it up. I dread the idea of Vanna becoming a deer and tidying up Ignacio's room, she once said. But David, overhearing this, lost his temper. She's not his maid, Sarah. He needs to learn to clean up after himself. Mom couldn't hold back and immediately shot back, you love her more than your own son. How can you treat Ignacio this way? I saw David's face darken, all the fight drained out of him. He looked at me with such sadness, such guilt, that it became hard for me to breathe. He raised his hands in surrender and quietly said, "Fine, fine. Your way." From then on, David stopped arguing with Mom about Ignacio. He no longer interfered in their dynamic, but the look he gave me in that moment said everything. He hadn't given up on me, even if he had given up fighting Mom. It was a small consolation, but sometimes small comforts are all we can cling to. Graduation day was bittersweet. I stood in my cap and gown, scanning the crowd for my parents' faces. I saw David, his face was beaming with pride, his eyes shining, and I knew he was happy for me, as if I were his own daughter. Mom was there too, but her attention was entirely consumed by her phone. She kept checking it, probably texting Ignacio's nanny. It was hard, but I had gotten used to it by then. Later that evening, David called me into his study. He had college brochures spread out before him. "You can go anywhere you want, Vanna," he said. "The world is open to you." But before I could respond, Mom stormed into the room like a whirlwind. "You can't be serious," she exclaimed. "We need to save money for Ignacio's future. He'll need it more than she will." David's face hardened, his eyes darkened, and I saw that familiar expression I had come to know over the years. He looked at Mom and said, "This is not up for discussion, Sarah. I've already made my decision." I listened to his words, trying to discern any sincerity, any chance he might still consider Ignacio's needs. But David's attempts to help Ignacio had long been overshadowed by disappointment that now colored every word he spoke. He was tired, not just physically but emotionally. His voice carried the weight of hopelessness, the kind that comes from trying to fix something that someone else refuses to address. "He probably just needs support," I said, though I didn't truly believe my own words. I wanted Ignacio to be different, but I knew it was impossible. He wasn't the person we had once known. The silence at the table was heavy. I knew my words couldn't erase the years Ignacio had spent shielded by his own indulgence, protected by Mom from reality. But deep down, I hoped that if he could just see my life, my small, one-bedroom apartment that had become my world, perhaps he might shift his perspective, even a little. But it was clear that I didn't have the magic words to wake him up. "You're right, Vanna," David finally said, setting down his fork. "He doesn't want to change. But I can't give up on him. I just can't." I nodded, understanding that he, like me, was at a crossroads. We both knew Ignacio had chosen his path, and we had no right to force him onto another. Yet David couldn't let go of his care for him, and I still felt the weight of the futile fight I had been part of but could never win. The conversation shifted back to my new home, but its lightness was overshadowed by the unspoken tension between us. We were both tethered to the past, to those years of trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. "You've done everything you could, David," I finally said. "It's not your fault." He shook his head, and I noticed a new crease forming on his forehead. No matter how much he tried, he couldn't shake his guilt. "It doesn't feel that way, Vanna," he said quietly. "Your mother thinks we shouldn't interfere in his life. That maybe all our efforts have only made things worse. Maybe he just needs time to figure it out on his own. But I can't stop thinking that maybe, at some point, things could have been different." I didn't know how to respond. I, too, felt that things could have been different once. But now, from a distance, we were both faced with the reality of Ignacio, someone who didn't know what it meant to take responsibility for his life. "I have a plan," David said, bringing the focus back to my new home. "You can invite him over when he's ready. Maybe that will change something." I felt a growing pain building in my chest. I couldn't imagine that he would want to visit me. He felt so distant, like a fog shrouding the memories of our childhood. But I agreed anyway. "All right," I said. "I'll try." That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at a crossroads. All of us, as we had for so many years, kept trying, but all it led to was loneliness. I listened to her carefully, but it was hard to believe. The conversation felt like a long-awaited return to the past, and yet strangely disconnected from reality. My mother, who had once been so full of energy and determination, now seemed helpless, worn down by constant struggle. I remembered her in her youth, a flawless woman, always striving to maintain perfect order and putting her family first. But now, before me, sat a slumped version of her, with wrinkles not just from age but from deep disappointment. This wasn't the same person who used to scold me for every misstep, for every complaint. I looked at her and couldn't understand when this transformation had happened. "Mom, you need to take better care of yourself," I said, swallowing my growing frustration. "You can't just give up." She nodded silently, but her gaze was empty, as if she had long accepted her fate and was now just waiting to see what would happen next. It wasn't just defeat, it was an entire life lost to trying to keep everything and everyone afloat until her own strength ran dry. "And Ignacio? Is he doing anything?" I asked again, though I already knew the answer would be just as disappointing. Mom crossed her arms over her lap again, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the fabric of her skirt. I noticed her face tighten, as though she were trying to conceal her embarrassment. He's looking for a job," she said, her voice flat, lacking any conviction in her own words. "But it's not his fault, Vanna. He's going through a tough time." I felt a wave of irritation rising. I didn't need explanations. I had heard them all before, back when Ignacio was a teenager, when he lacked discipline and shirked responsibility. But now, at 20, he was still lingering in his virtual reality, avoiding the real world that was crumbling around him. Was there really nothing for him beyond his toys and his friends, with whom he drank and partied? "I don't understand how you can tolerate this," I said, unable to hide my anger. You say he's struggling, but struggling with what? That he can't find a job, or that he doesn't want to? Mom seemed unprepared for my open aggression. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at me, her gaze tinged with exhaustion and helplessness. You don't understand, Vanna. It's complicated. You don't see how he's changing. I leaned back against the couch, trying to calm down. Every word from her felt like an excuse, and I knew that, in her eyes, I was the one judging her, though that wasn't entirely true. I wasn't judging her, I was judging what had happened to our family. Once, we had been a strong unit, but now I sat here in this old house, where everything seemed to be disappearing and falling apart, trying to figure out where we had gone wrong, where the moments were when things could have been different. You can try to justify it all you want, Mom, but I can't accept it, I said quietly. You know as well as I do that Ignacio isn't changing, yet you keep making excuses for him. Why? Why do you keep doing this? Mom didn't respond, but her expression said everything. She knew I was right. But, as always, she preferred to believe her own excuses because it was easier that way. The moment Bianca, without even glancing at me, tore into the bag of cookies with a flourish, I felt something cold and sharp, like an icy knife, pierce deep inside me. A mixed feeling of bewilderment and irritation filled every inch of my being. It wasn't just surprise that Ignacio, who seemed fully engrossed in his games and endless job interviews, had brought this woman into our house. No, it was something more, something indescribable in that moment. He hadn't just brought her, he paraded her as a badge of pride, as some sort of accomplishment. I stepped back, my gaze catching on the peeling wallpaper and that familiar dent in the ceiling, a reminder of the days when David had cared for this house as if it were his fortress. Everything around me felt foreign, alien, as if I were standing in a space where order and harmony no longer existed. Bianca, sprawled out on the floor, was the embodiment of that chaos, with her heavy makeup and tight-fitting clothes that seemed designed to scream her worth to everyone around her, yet showing no respect for anyone at all. You promised you'd find a job, Ignacio, I said, addressing his indifferent figure, which stood as a mere backdrop to this scene. His face was half hidden from me, and I felt as though I could barely see him. It was a strange sensation, to be so close to my brother yet feel an unbridgeable chasm between us. He didn't respond, just gave a lazy nod and continued tapping on his phone. Bianca seemed fascinated by his actions, as though her entire world revolved around the screen. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. These were people I knew, yet they had lost all connection to who they once were. My hand instinctively clenched into a fist, but I held myself back. Instead of continuing to fight against the scene before me, I forced myself to face reality. How did we get here? How did a family once full of care become so empty and soulless? I realized there would be no answer, though the pain of these questions seeped into every fiber of my being. Are you going to do anything? I asked Ignacio, but again, my words seemed to vanish into the void, failing to reach his consciousness. He was already engrossed in a new level of his game, and before I could even finish my sentence, he mumbled something under his breath and returned to what he was doing. I turned to my mother, who was silently observing the chaos, as she always did, trying to ignore it. She looked tired, her eyes devoid of the determination they once held, now reflecting only helplessness. She sat in the corner, masking her emotions, but I knew she was fully aware that all of this was her responsibility. Like me, she was trapped in this endless cycle. But unlike me, she couldn't move forward. Mom, how can you tolerate this? I asked calmly, though my voice carried not just anger but also pain. He doesn't work, he doesn't look for a job, and you just accept it. Why do you still let him sit here while everything is falling apart? She looked at me, and in her gaze, I saw the same exhaustion that had plagued her for years. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of responsibility, and her eyes held a void, as if she had long since stopped hoping for a change. There's nothing I can do, Vanna, she said softly, almost helplessly. I've done everything I could. I sighed and, unsure of what else to say, stepped outside. The night air was crisp, refreshing against my face, but all the tension of the evening, all the attempts to make sense of what had become of the home where I once felt safe, lingered with me. This house, like my entire life, had been consumed by growing chaos. I took a deep breath and looked at this fragment of my life, once so close to my heart, now foreign and unrecognizable. I stood in the empty hallway, unable to move, when a loud, mocking laugh from Bianca echoed behind me. That laugh, raw and merciless like a venomous thorn, seemed to pierce my shoulders, making them tremble. Its echoes reverberated in my ears even as my feet began moving across the cold floor, taking me away from what I had just witnessed. The door closed with a sound that seemed to resonate in the space, an echo that matched the ache in my heart. It was a strange feeling, as if the world around me had suddenly shifted. Everything I knew, everything I relied on, had crumbled with a hollow crash, leaving only ruins. It wasn't an unexpected turn. I had suspected something was wrong for a long time, but I had never thought it would hurt this much. I expected this from Ignacio, but not from my mother. She, in essence, had become a stranger, just like everyone else I once loved. I felt the weight of her words again, their emptiness and cruelty. You never understood that he's a parasite. Like a knife to the heart. Everything I had tried to do, all these years spent earning her love, proving I was worthy of being close to her, now felt hollow and insignificant. All the sacrifices, all the efforts to be a good daughter, they meant nothing. Shaken, I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't even look back at the house that now belonged to Ignacio. No, it wasn't a house, it was a box where she hid her lies and ambitions. I didn't believe her, couldn't believe she had done this. But something in her eyes, that expression of cold indifference when she told me she never loved me as much as Ignacio, made me realize that everything I thought about myself, everything I hoped to gain from her, had vanished. My footsteps sounded dull against the empty street. The fog, suddenly descending on the city, added an extra weight to the moment. I stopped at a corner, unsure of what to do, where to go. I had no plans, no direction. All I knew was that there was no home for me anymore. These two people who were once my family had become strangers. My mother, who had abandoned me, and Ignacio, who had always remained in the shadows of his own inaction. And Bianca, with her sinister smile, now felt like a curse that would haunt me. Their triumph was my defeat, their happiness my pain. I stood under the streetlight and thought. What now? Where had all this led? Everything I knew, everything I believed in, had been destroyed in an instant. I couldn't think about what was left behind anymore. I had to move forward, but how? I looked at my hands. They were empty, like my gaze. But if I had endured these years, I could survive this blow too. Perhaps now was the time to find myself again, to rebuild my life without looking back, without trying to please those who never understood me. I took a step forward and finally realized I could no longer let these people destroy my soul. The journey back from my mother's house was a blur. I don't remember the 4-hour trip, don't remember climbing the stairs to my apartment, don't even remember sitting on the couch. All I felt was emptiness. The silence surrounding me was deafening, as if the universe itself had quieted, waiting for me to return to myself. But one thought, like a lightning bolt, pierced my mind. My gaze fell on my phone, and I saw the automatic transfer of money, $1,500 every month. A year. A year I couldn't recall, spent on others. My finger lingered for a moment over the screen as images flashed through my mind. Mom, Ignacio, Bianca, all these years, every month, every transfer. The debt I had willingly carried. Weighing it all in that moment, I pressed cancel recurring payment. It was a decisive action. Small, but so significant. I cut that thread that had tied me to the past, a thread that had always felt like a burden. In the following weeks, I immersed myself in work. Surprisingly, the money I no longer sent wasn't a heavy load. On the contrary, it became an opportunity. I began exploring investment options, looking for something that could change my future. Now, I had the chance to start saving for my own home. Not an apartment I could rent out, not a place where I had always felt like a stranger. No, now I could afford a real home. A month after making this decision, Mom called. Without any greetings, without asking how I was or how things were going. Just like we were continuing a conversation without interruption. "We have no money," she said, her voice tense. "Is this a bank mistake?" "No," I replied, surprised at how calm I sounded. "I canceled the transfers." The silence on the line was overwhelming. I could hear her take a deep breath, preparing to explode. "How dare you? After everything I've done for you, you refuse to help?" I could barely hold back a laugh. Everything she had done for me? How many years had I spent trying to earn her attention, her approval, and here she was again, presenting it as her sacrifice. A sacrifice she never asked of me. "Did you forget?" Mom continued, her voice now tinged with anger and desperation. "Ignacio and Bianca need that money. They're planning a vacation." "Oh, really?" I interrupted her, not even trying to hide my sarcasm. "Ignacio needs a break from video games and beer?" It felt as though I could finally breathe, like after holding my breath for so long. Mom, who had always made excuses for Ignacio, was now trying to blame me for his troubles. "You're just jealous because I left everything to him. You've ruined everything for me." Her words lost their power. I, like someone standing on a cliff, felt a lightness with every word. Lighter because I had finally stopped fearing her anger, her manipulations. This was the breaking point I had been waiting for, even though I hadn't fully realized it until then. "Goodbye, Mom," I said. "Don't call me again." I didn't wait for a response. I pressed block and stopped listening. But it didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, messages, calls, social media comments flooded in, all from the same old script. Mom cried, blamed me for destroying the family. Ignacio sent aggressive messages explaining how I was depriving them of support. Their creativity knew no bounds, but I remained unmoved. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel I owed them anything. Those $1,500 I no longer sent weren't just savings. They were my money. My freedom. My chance to build a life that no longer depended on them. Time passed. I was finally able to buy my own home. I don't remember when I first felt at home. In my own home. That moment when you realize you no longer owe anyone, when you can live by your own rules. I began to sleep peacefully. David would have been proud of me. Yes, he would have been proud. Proud of how I found the strength to stand on my own, to stop being a victim of their manipulations. One day, as I passed a construction site, I saw a help wanted sign. For a moment, I thought about taking a photo and sending it to Ignacio, just like I used to, but now I just smiled and kept walking. That was no longer my problem. I wasn't going to be part of their world anymore. Freedom was my reward.